Chapter 1. At no time during the 24 hours was the Bull and Mouth Inn a place of quiet or repose, and by 10 o'clock in the morning, when the stage-coach from Wisbeach, turning top-heavily out of Aldersgate, lumbered into its yard, it seemed to one weary and downcast passenger at least to be crowded with vehicles of every description, from a yellow-bodied post-chaise to a waggon with its shafts cocked up and the various packages and bundles it carried strewn over the yard. All was bustle and confusion, and for a few minutes Miss Malvern, climbing down from the coach, was bewildered by it, and stood looking round her rather helplessly, until the guard dumped at her feet the small corded trunk which contained her worldly possessions, and advised her to look sharp to it. No one paid the least attention to her, except an ostler leading out 2 horses and adjuring her to get out of the way, and one of the inevitable street vendors who haunted busy inn-yards begging her to buy some gingerbread. The guard, assailed by demands from several anxious travellers to have their bags and bandboxes restored to them immediately, had little time to spare. But Miss Malvern's flower-like countenance and her air of youthful innocence impelled him to ask her if anyone was meeting her. When she shook her head, he clicked his tongue disapprovingly, and expressed a hope she might at least know where she was a-going to. A gleam of amusement lightened the shadows in Miss Malvern's large grey eyes. She replied with a tiny chuckle, "Oh, yes, I do know that." "What you want, missy, is a hack," said the guard. "No, I don't. I want a porter," said Miss Malvern, speaking with unexpected decision. The guard seemed to be inclined to argue this point, but as a stout lady was tugging at his coat-tails, shrilly demanding to know what he had done with a basket of fish consigned to his care, he was obliged to abandon Miss Malvern to her fate, merely shouting in stentorian accents for a porter to carry the young lady's trunk. This summons was responded to by a burly individual in a frieze coat, who undertook for the sum of 6pence to carry Miss Malvern's trunk to the warehouse of Josiah, Ned and Son, carriers. Since this establishment was situated a bare quarter of a mile from the Bull and Mouth, Miss Malvern had a shrewd suspicion that she was being grossly overcharged. But although an adventurous youth spent in following the drum had accustomed her to haggling with Portuguese farmers and Spanish muleteers, she did not feel inclined to embark on argument in a crowded London inn-yard, so she agreed on the price and desired the porter to lead her to the warehouse. The premises, acquired some years earlier by Mr. Ned and his son, had originally been an inn, of neither the size nor the quality of the Bull and Mouth, but like it provided with a galleried yard and a number of stables and coach-houses. Occupying a large part of the yard was an enormous waggon mounted on 9-inch cylindrical wheels and covered by a spreading tilt. 3 brawny lads were engaged in loading this vehicle with a collection of goods, ranging from pack-cases to farm implements, their activities being directed and shrilly criticized by an aged gentleman who was seated on the balcony on one side of the yard. Beneath this balcony, a glass door had once invited entrance to the coffee-room, but this had been replaced by a green-painted wooden door, flanked by tubs filled with geraniums, and furnished with a bright brass knocker, indicating that the erstwhile hostelry had become a private residence. Picking her way between the piles of packages and directing the porter to follow her, Miss Malvern went to it, lifting its latch without ceremony, and stepping into a narrow passage, from which a door gave access into the old coffee-room, and a flight of uneven stairs rose to the upper floors. The trunk set down and the porter dismissed, Miss Malvern heaved a sigh of relief, as of one who had accomplished an enterprise fraught with peril, and called, "Sarah?" No immediate response being forthcoming, she called again, more loudly, and moved to the foot of the stairs. But even as she set her foot on the bottom step, a door at the end of the passage burst open, and a lady in a flowered print dress, with an old-fashioned tucker round her ample bosom, and a starched muslin cap tied in a bow beneath her chin, stood as though stunned on the threshold, and gasped, "Oh, Miss Kate! It's never you! Oh, my dearie, my precious lambkin!" She started forward, holding out her plump arms, and Miss Malvern, laughing and crying, tumbled into them, hugging her and uttering disjointedly, "Oh, Sarah! Oh, Sarah! Oh, to be with you again! I've been thinking of nothing else all the way. Oh, Sarah, I'm so tired and dispirited, and there was nowhere else for me to go. But indeed, I don't mean to impose on you or on poor Mr. Ned, only until I can find another situation." Several teardrops stood on Mrs. Ned's cheeks, but she said in a scolding voice, "Now that's no way to talk, Miss Kate, and well you know it. And where else should you go, I should like to know? Now you come into the kitchen like a good girl while I pop the kettle on and cut some bread and butter." Miss Malvern dried her eyes and sighed. "Oh, dear, would you have believed I could be so ticklish? It was such a horrid journey, 6 of us inside, and no time to swallow more than a sip of coffee when we stopped for breakfast." Mrs. Ned, leading her into the kitchen and thrusting her into a chair, demanded, "Are you telling me you came on the common stage, Miss Kate?" "Yes, of course I did." "Well, you couldn't expect them to have sent me by post, could you? And if you're thinking of the mail, I'm excessively glad they didn't send me by that either, because it reached London just after 4 o'clock in the morning. What should I have done?" "You'd have come round here straight. For goodness sake, dearie, what's happened to bring you back in such a bang with never a word to me so I could have met you?" "There was no time," explained Kate. "Besides, I couldn't have got a franc. And why should you be obliged to pay for a letter when you were going to see me immediately? I've been turned off, Sarah." "Turned off?" repeated Mrs. Ned terribly. "Yes, but not without a character," said Kate with an irrepressible twinkle. "At least, Mrs. Grittleton wouldn't have given me one, but Mr. Astley assured me his wife would, and was very sorry to lose me, which indeed I expect she is, because we dealt very well together, and I did make the children mind me." "And who, pray, may this Mrs. Grittleton be?" said Mrs. Ned, pausing in the act of measuring tea leaves into a large pot. "A griffin," replied Kate. "I'd griffin her. But who is she, love? And what had she to say to anything?" "She is Mrs. Astley's mother. She had everything to say, I promise you. She took me in dislike the moment she saw me. She said I was too young to have charge of her grandchildren, and she told poor Mrs. Astley that I had insinuating manners. Oh, yes, and that I was sly and designing. That was because her detestable son tried to kiss me, and I slapped his face, though why she should have thought that was being designing I can't conceive. Oh, Sarah, you never saw such a moon calf. He's as silly as his sister, and not by half as agreeable. She may be a wet goose, which indeed she is, but the most amiable creature. And as for my being too young to have the charge of the children, she was a great deal too young to have 3 children. Why, she's no more than 3 years older than I am, Sarah, and such a featherhead. And now she has miscarried of a 4th child, and Mrs. Grittleton set it at my door. And I must say I thought it pretty poor-spirited of Mr. Astley not to have turned her out of the house, because he told me she never came to stay with them but to make trouble. And as for young Grittleton," she broke off with a gurgle of laughter, "the things he said about him, Sarah, I couldn't but laugh, and the odious creature's intentions were most honourable. He made me an offer. That, of course, was what threw Mrs. Grittleton into such a pelter, for try as I would, I couldn't make her believe that nothing could prevail upon me to marry her detestable son. She ranted like an archwife, and scolded poor Mrs. Astley into such a pucker that she fell into strong convulsions and miscarried. So Mr. Astley saw nothing for it but to send me away. I own he behaved very handsomely, for he paid me for the whole year, not merely the 6 months I had truly earned, and sent me to the coach-stop in his own carriage. But considering he told me himself that he held me blameless, I can't but think it was very poor-spirited of him not to have sent Mrs. Grittleton packing instead of me." "Poor-spirited!" ejaculated Mrs. Ned, removing the lid from one of the pots on the fire and viciously stirring its contents. So you may, and so they are, all of them. Anything for peace and quiet, that's men." She replaced the lid on the pot and turned to look down at her nursling, trouble in her face. "I'm not saying that you should have accepted that young Grittleton's offer, but, oh, dearie me, what's to be done now?" "I must find myself another situation, of course," responded Kate. "I mean to visit the registry office this very day. Only—" She paused, eyeing Mrs. Ned uncertainly. Only what? Demanded that lady. Well, I have been thinking, Sarah, and although I know you won't agree with me, I believe I should be very well advised to seek a situation in a domestic capacity. In it? Never, while I'm alive, said Mrs. Nidd. The Lord knows it went against the pluck with me when you hired yourself out as a governess, but at least it was genteel. But if you're thinking of going out as a cook-maid, or... I shouldn't think anyone who wasn't all about in her head would hire me, interrupted Kate, laughing. You know, I can't bake an egg without burning it. No, I believe I might do very well, or at any rate tolerably well, as an Abigail. In fact, I dare say I could rise to be a dresser. Then, you know, I should be a person of huge consequence, besides making my fortune. Mrs. Astley's housekeeper has a cousin who is a dresser to a lady of fashion, and you wouldn't believe how plump in the pocket she is. No, I wouldn't, retorted Mrs. Nidd, and even if I did... But it is perfectly true, insisted Kate. For one thing, a first-rate dresser commands a far bigger wage than a mere governess, besides being a person of very much more consequence. Unless, of course, the governess should be excessively well-educated and able to instruct her charges in all the genteel accomplishments. And even then, you know, nobody slides sovereigns or bills into her hand to win her favour. Well, upon my word, uttered Mrs. Nidd explosively. Kate's eyes danced. Yes, isn't it shocking? But beggars can't be choosers, and I've made up my mind to it that to make my fortune, or at any rate to win an independence, is of more importance than to preserve my gentility. No, listen, Sarah. You must know that I have no accomplishments. I can't speak Italian or play the piano, far less the harp, and even if people wish their children to be instructed in Spanish, which they don't, I don't think they'd wish them to learn soldiers' Spanish, which is all I know. On the other hand, I can sew and make and dress a head to admiration. I did so once for Mrs. Astley when she was going to a ball, and her woman had made a perfect botch of her hair. So you... No, said Mrs. Nidd in a tone which brooked no argument. Now, you drink your tea and eat your nice bread and butter, and no more nonsense. If ever I listen to such a pack of skimble-scamble stuff, and I don't want to hear any more about imposing on me and Ned, for there's no question of that, and I take it unkindly of you to say such a thing, Miss Kate. Kate caught her hand and nursed it to her cheek. No, Sarah, you know better. How infamous it would be if I were to foist myself onto you. When I think of all you have to do, with old Mr. Nidd living here, and all those grandsons of his to feed and house, I feel it's quite shameless of me to come to you even for a short visit. I couldn't stay here forever, dearest Sarah. You must own I couldn't. No, you couldn't, acknowledged Mrs. Nidd. It wouldn't be fitting. Not but what there's only 3 grandsons, and one of them lives with his ma. That's Joe's sister Maggie, and the most gormless creature you ever did see. Still, there's no harm in her, and I'm bound to say she's always ready to come and lend me a bit of help, if help you can call it. But a carrier's yard is no place for you, dearie, and well do I know it. We'll think of something, never you fear. I have thought of something, murmured Kate wickedly. No, you haven't, Miss Kate. You're puckered with that nasty stagecoach and all the uproar that was kicked up by that Mrs. Brimstone, or whatever she calls herself. And you'll feel different when I've got you tucked into bed, which I'm going to do the minute you've drunk up your tea. You'll have your sleep out, and when you wake up you shall have your dinner in the parlour upstairs, and we'll see what's to be done. Kate sighed. I am very tired, she confessed. But I shall be happy to eat my dinner downstairs with the rest of you. I don't wish... An ox cheek with dumplings, interrupted Mrs. Nidd. I dare say, but it ain't what I wish, Miss Kate, and nor it isn't what Nidd or the boys would wish neither. For to be sitting down to their dinner in company with a young lady like yourself will put them into such a stew, minding their manners and that, as would turn them clean against their victuals. So you'll do as Sarah tells you, dearie, and believe that Sarah knows best, supplied Kate, submitting. Which you can be bound I do, said Mrs. Nidd. Miss Malvern was neither so young nor so guileless as her flower-like countenance frequently led strangers to suppose. She was 24 years old, and her life had not been passed in a sheltered schoolroom. the sole offspring of a clandestine marriage between the charming but sadly unsatisfactory scion of a distinguished family and a romantic girl of great beauty but somewhat inferior lineage, she was born in a garrison town and reared in a succession of lodgings and billets. The runaway bride whom Captain Morven had captivated disappointed her scandalized relations by suffering no regret whatsoever at being repudiated by them, and falsified their expectations by remaining so ridiculously besotted that neither the discomforts of following the drum nor the aberrations of her volatile spouse abated her love or daunted her spirits. She brought Kate up in the belief that Papa was the personification of every virtue, the embarrassing situations in which from time to time he found himself arising not from any obliquity but from an excess of amiability, and that it was the duty of his wife and daughter to cherish him. She died in Portugal when Kate was 12 years old, almost with her last breath adjuring Kate to take good care of Papa, and to the best of her ability Kate had done so, aided and abetted by her redoubtable nurse. Sarah cherished no illusions, but like nearly all who were acquainted with him, she was a victim of his compelling charm. "Poor dear gentleman," Sarah had said after his funeral. "He had his faults like the best of us. Not that I'm saying he was the best, because telling faradiddles is what I don't hold with, and there's few knows better than me that you couldn't depend on him, not for a moment. While as for the way he wasted his money, it used to put me in such a tweak that there were times when I didn't know how to keep my tongue between my teeth. He never took thought to the morrow, and nor did my poor dear mistress neither. You never knew where you was, for there wouldn't be enough money to buy one scraggy chicken in the market one day, and the next he'd come in singing out that the dibs was in tune and not a thought in his head, or my mistress's but how to spend it quickest. Well, he told me once that it was no use ringing a peal over him for going to low gaming houses, because he was born with a spring in his elbow, and there was no sport in playing cards and such in the regiment, for nearly all the officers was living on their pay, same as he was himself. But this I will say for him, there was never a sweeter-tempered nor a kinder-hearted man alive." "Aye," had agreed Mr. Ned rather doubtfully, "though it don't seem to me as he behaved very kind to Miss Kate, leaving her like he done with a lot of debts to pay and nobody's prize money to do it with, what was left of it, which, by what you told me, wasn't so very much neither." "He always thought he'd win a fortune, and how was he to know he was going to meet his end like he has? Oh, Joe, I wish he'd been killed at Waterloo, for this is worse than anything, when I think of him that was always so gay and up to the knocker, no matter whether he was plump in the pocket or regularly in the basket, being knocked down by a common tax cart. Well, it makes me thankful my poor mistress ain't alive to see it, which is a thing I never thought to be, and my poor lamb left alone without a sixpence to scratch with, and she's so devoted to her pa. I never ought to have married you, Joe, and it weighs on me that I let you wheedle me into it, for if ever Miss Kate needed me, she needs me now." "I need you too, Sary," had said Mr. Ned with difficulty. Observing the look of anxiety on his face, Sarah had mopped her eyes and implanted a smacking kiss on his cheek, saying, "And a good, kind husband you are, Joe, and if there was more, as faithful as what you proved yourself to be, the world would be a better place." Colouring darkly, Mr. Ned had uttered an inarticulate protest, but this rare tribute from his sharp-tongued spouse had been well earned. Falling deeply in love with a much younger Sarah, who had been on the eve of accompanying her mistress and her nursling to Portugal, and had rejected his offer, he had indeed remained faithful. 7 years later, "just like Jacob," had said Kate, urging her nurse to the altar, when Sarah had come back to England with her widowed master and his daughter, he had renewed his suit, and his constancy had been rewarded. Miss Sarah Pablo had changed her name to Ned, and had lost no time at all in assuming the control of her husband's family and vastly improving their fortunes. Within a year she had bullied and cajoled her aged father-in-law into spending his jealously hoarded savings on the acquisition of the inn, which now provided the firm with spacious headquarters, and had transformed it from a single carrier into an establishment which, if it did not yet rival Pickford's, was in a fair way to providing Pickford's with some healthy competition. Her husband adored her. His father, while losing no opportunity to get the better of her, had been known to inform his cronies at the Cock, when mellowed by a sufficient quantity of what he inelegantly termed belly juice, that she was a sure card. His sisters wavered between ineffective resentment of her managing disposition and a comfortable dependence on her willingness to assist them in any difficulty. And his nephews, all as inarticulate as he was himself, said simply that you wouldn't get a more bang-up dinner anywhere than what Aunt Sarah would give you. Even Miss Malvern, for all her 24 years, turned instinctively to her in times of trouble, and was insensibly reassured by her air of competence. Tucked now into bed, told that there was no need to get into high fidgets, and adjured to go to sleep, she thought, snuggling into the feathered softness, that perhaps she had allowed herself to become too despondent, and that Sarah really did know best. But Sarah, stumping downstairs again to the kitchen, was feeling far from competent, and although the dinner she presently set before her husband, her father-in-law, one of her nephews, and 2 of the lads employed in the stables, in no way betrayed her inward perturbation, she ate very little of her own portion, and was a trifle short in her responses to the remarks addressed to her. This circumstance did not escape the notice of Mr. Nid Senior or of Mr. Nid Junior, but when the younger Nid, a simple-minded soul, began anxiously to ask if anything were amiss, his more astute sire cut him short, adjuring him not to be a jobbernoll, and inquiring affably of Sarah if it wasn't Miss Kate he had seen crossing the yard a while back. "Which I hopes it was," he said, mopping up the gravy on his plate with a large lump of bread, "for she's been first oars with me from the moment I clapped eyes on her, and she's heartily welcome. A prettier gal I never did see, and nothing niffy-naffy about her. Sweet as a nut she is, but for all she don't hold up her nose at folks like us, she's a proper lady. And don't you forget it, young Ted," he concluded, rounding suddenly on his grandson with such ferocity that the hapless youth dropped his knife. "If you was to behave disrespectful to her, I'd lay your back open." Such was the awe in which his descendants held him, that young Ted, a brawny giant, saw nothing absurd in this threat, but informed him in stammering haste that nothing was further from his intentions than to treat Miss Kate with disrespect. He accepted this assurance, but caused the 2 hirelings to quake by saying, "As for you, you'll keep out of her way, couple of clod-crushers." At this point Sarah intervened, telling her father-in-law that there was no call for him to rake the poor lads down, and providing them with generous portions of apple pie. She spoke sharply, but she was not unappreciative of the tribute he had paid her darling, and when the younger members of the party had withdrawn, and Mr. Nid had bade her empty her budget, she said, in a much milder tone, "Well, I don't mean to fall into the dismals, but I am in a worry, father, that I can't deny." "Ah," said Mr. Nid, "on account of Miss Kate, I suspicioned as much. What brought her back to London in such a crack? Not but what you don't have to tell me, because I ain't a cod's head. Someone's tried to give her a slip on the shoulder, which is what I thought would happen, for it stands to reason. A spanking beauty like she is, which is allowed by them as should have known better to go jauntering around the country unbefriended, is bound to find herself in the briars." "Yes, and well I know it," cried Sarah, stung by this palpable dig at herself. "But what could I do when her mind was made up, and she was as poor as a church rat? I thought she'd be safe with that Mrs. Astley." "That's where you was a woolly crown, my girl," said Mr. Nid, with a certain amount of satisfaction, "because if Mrs. Astley's husband is a ramshackle—" "It wasn't him," interrupted Sarah, very much flushed. "He behaved very proper to Miss Kate. It was Mrs. Astley's brother. And he don't seem to have been a ramshackle, though he'd no business to go trying to kiss Miss Kate. He made her an offer." "Now that," said Mr. Nid, "is something like. What Miss Kate wants is a husband." "You needn't think I don't know that, father. If this young Brittleton had taken her fancy, I'd have thanked God on my knees. For all she'd have been demeaning herself, she'd been above the Astley's cut. But she didn't. A moon calf is what she says he is. Well, such ain't a particle of use to her, said Mr. Ned, abandoning interest in young Brittleton. What is she meaning to do now, Sary? Hire herself out as a common Abigail, replied Sarah bitterly. At this disclosure, the younger Mr. Ned looked very much shocked and said she must not be allowed to do it. He added diffidently, if she'd lower herself to live here with you to take care of her, we'd be proud to have her, wouldn't we, Father? It's no matter what we'd be, it wouldn't fit, responded Mr. Ned unhesitatingly. If you'd ever had any wits, I'd be wondering where they'd gone a-begging. How I came to have a son that was no better than a chalk bacon is something I'll never know, not if I live to be 100. No, nor I'll never know how you came to have a son with such a good heart, snapped Sarah, rising instantly to Joe's defence. A mumbled remonstrance from him caused her to pat his hand and to say in a mollified tone, I'm sure I don't want to offend you, Father, but I won't have you miscalling Joe. Not but what he's right, Joe, it wouldn't fit. But how to stop her doing what's beneath her, I don't know. Perhaps your father does, so long-headed as he is. You can lay your life I do, said Mr. Ned, a gleam of triumph in his eye. To think I've a longer head than you, Sary. What Miss Kate's got to have is a home with her own kin. Aye, she did ought to have that, agreed his son, much struck by this display of wisdom. I said it when the Major took and died, and I'll say it again, pursued Mr. Ned. Her relations ought to be wrote to, and don't you pitch me any gammon about her not having none like you did aforesaid, because it's hornswoggle. We all got kin of some sort. Yes, said Sarah slowly, but there's none left on my mistress's side but her sister, and if she'd lived a finger to help Miss Kate, she's mightily changed since I knew her. What's more, Miss Kate wouldn't have anything to say to that said, nor I wouldn't wish her to, the way he behaved to her mamma. I don't say she hasn't maybe got some cousins, but I don't know who they are or where they live or anything about them. And as for the Major, I never heard tell of any relations other than his half-sister, and he paid no more heed to her than she did to him. She married a title gentleman that had a place called Staplewood, which made the Major laugh out when he read about it, telling my mistress there was never anyone more ambitious than his sister, and the only thing that surprised him was that she was content with a baronet instead of having set her cap at a duke or a marquis or some such. Still, I fancy he must be a high-up baronet, because the Major said, well done, Minerva, broom of Staplewood no less. And my mistress told me it was a very old family that had lived at this Staplewood since I don't know when, and all as proud as peacocks. But I don't know where it may be, nor it wouldn't signify if I did, for the Major said his sister had risen quite beyond his touch now, and if he got more than a common bow from her, if ever they was to meet again, he'd have nothing more to do than bless himself for his good fortune, supposing he didn't suffer a palsy stroke. Her eyes filled. She wiped away the sudden tears, saying, he was always so full of fun and gig, poor dear gentleman. Whenever I think of the way... But it's no manner of use thinking of what's done and can't be undone. The thing is that it isn't to be expected that she'd do anything to help Miss Kate, when she'd got to be too proud to behave civil to her own brother. Besides, I don't know where she lives. That don't signify, said Mr. Ned impatiently. There's books as'll tell you where the nobles and the landed gentry lives, and there's directories too. What I'm thinking is that a starched-up lady wouldn't wish for her niece to be ironing herself out like Miss Kate means to. Now, what's the matter with you, Joe? The younger Mr. Ned, who had been sitting with his brow furrowed in painful cogitation, opening his mouth as if to speak and shutting it again, gulped, and answered diffidently that he rather thought he did know. Know what? Demanded his progenitor irascibly. Staplewood, produced Joe. Aye, that was it. Market Harbour. Leastways, it ain't there, but nearby, seemingly, because the orders was to set the package down at the Angel. Likely they would have sent in a cart or a farm wagon, maybe, to fetch it. I disremember what it was, but I got it into my head that it was a big pack case, such as you could put a piano into, though I don't know that it was a piano, mind. No, and it don't make any odds if it was a kitchen stove, said Mr. Ned. All we want to know... You've hit it, "That," uttered Joe, his frown banished by a broad grin. "If you aren't a one," he said in affectionate admiration. "A bodily range, that's what it was. It come back to me the moment you said stove." Mr. Ned cast his eyes upwards in entreaty. "Don't heed him, Sary," he begged. "He always was a knocking the cradle, and he always will be. What you got to do is to write a letter to Miss Kate's aunt, telling her as how Miss Kate's left properly in the basket and meaning to get herself hired as a housemaid or a shopwoman, very likely. You want to tell her who you are and how the Major was took off sudden when she maybe don't know, but you don't run on like a fiddlestick. If you was to cross your lines, it's 10 to 1 she wouldn't be able to read 'em, and if you was to take a second